and welcome to episode 108 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And I'm Jon Dinning in Los Angeles.
Jon, it's been a crazy week, but how are you doing today?
I'm a mixed bag of emotions, I suppose. It has been a crazy week, but when this comes out, it will also be Cinco de Mayo. So I'm drowning all of my disappointments.
Sorrows. Yeah. I think that tells me what you're probably drinking, but why don't you tell me?
I have a suspicion that we've probably picked the same poison today. I didn't have the full accoutrements for a real margarita, but I had a lot of tequila and I had some limes. So I've done kind of a makeshift margarita, mostly citrusy tequila on ice.
That's still pretty good.
I'm guessing you went in a similar but more appropriate direction.
I did go that way, but I want to know what kind of tequila you're using.
I've just got Casamigos Blanco.
Casamigos.
Yeah, mid-shelf.
Very nice. I am also drinking a margarita, although a little bit more margarita as opposed to more tequila. Straight tequila is not a good thing for me, I'll be honest.
Well, it's not a good thing for anybody, but that doesn't stop me.
Last time I had a lot of tequila, I had a reaction to it, so we're trying to avoid that.
Yeah, I have lots of reactions to it.
Tonight, though.
Do you guys use like a margarita mix when you make them at the house?
I think that's what she does.
Yeah.
She uses a lot of fresh lime, though, too. That's part of it. So I think it's kind of like a slightly modified. It's the ex-bartender in her. But I'm actually, this is Herradura Añejo.
Nice.
Which you've given me some good bottles, but this is one of my favorites from the old times because Añejo is just so much easier for me to drink.
Yeah, I should put a disclaimer on this of sorts because I sometimes get grief from people who listen to this that your drinks are so much more sophisticated than mine are. And that is fair, but you also have a live-in bartender, and I have to do this all on my own. So,
well, these are the choices we make, Jon, and I've chosen wisely.
You married well.
So what's the song of the night? You were the final selector, although we had many, many options.
Yeah, you gave me quite a list here to choose from. The menu is robust. I picked a song by a group called Owl City, who I'm not terribly familiar with, but I do like the song. In particular, I like the song title. It's called Dreams and Disasters. And I think as people, if they're not aware already, as we go through this April LSAT recap, they'll understand exactly why we picked a song called Dreams and Disasters.
And that's why I'm saying there were a lot of options because I was going through various song choices and kept coming up with great ones. And as I said to you prior to the start of this podcast, this is no problem because eventually they'll get used anyway. So now I've just selected songs for future podcasts now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very bleak outlook, but you're right.
Yeah, all I had to do was look up disaster and then catastrophe, and I had plenty of options for this podcast.
Sad but true, and fitting, regrettably. Let's talk about it, man. Let's get into the LSAT world, drink our tequila, and regret. So first things first, let's talk about this test isn't actually over. The April LSAT, as we're going to recap, it'll cover the days we've seen so far, but there are still a couple of testing days left for April, folks. We're going to call them April makeups. There was a makeup yesterday. We're recording this on Wednesday, May 3rd, Tuesday. There were some makeups allowed. And then there's going to be another set of makeups this coming Saturday, which is the 7th, and another set of makeup exams next Tuesday, May 10th.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this without being completely aware of what just happened, the April LSAT started this past Friday and was scheduled for Friday and Saturday, and then on Tuesday as well. That would be the accommodated / international test. On Saturday, as we will talk a little bit more about in a minute or two, there was a huge technical meltdown that knocked people out of their tests and stopped hundreds of people from getting into the test. And so when that happens at that level, the test makers have no choice but to start scrambling and offering makeups. And they gave 3 dates for that. Tuesday the 3rd, Saturday, May 7th, where they finally came out with, we'll get a little more into that, and then Tuesday, May 10th, which was the scheduled makeup date. And so what we know is that at this point, the content that was seen on Friday, Saturday, and Tuesday, that is now all out of use. So we're able to go ahead and do this podcast. I talked to LSAC about it. We kind of like jointly cleared that we were in good shape to go ahead and release this. And then we still have 2 more test days. That's coming up this Saturday, May 7th and Tuesday, May 10th. I know some people are listening to this thinking I'm going to get a bunch of information about those tests. I'm sorry to say that you are not. Maybe I'm happy to say I really don't know how I feel about it, but you will not. They will be using different test forms because once there's been enough time, too much information comes out about the test. And so the exams that people had over the first 3 days are not going to be the same exams that are coming out on Saturday and Tuesday. Now, Jon, we'll see. Depending on how much information we get about Saturday and Tuesday's tests, we may do another podcast.
Yeah.
I'm not going to guarantee it, though.
An April recap part 2, basically, for the final 2 days worth of people. We usually don't do recaps for the makeup tests that happen about a week and a half or so later because it's just such a small group and we don't hear all that much. We'll see. We'll see what kind of information trickles out Saturday and Tuesday. I would love to be able to do it because I know there are a lot of people who would normally be hearing about their test right now and unfortunately weren't able to complete the test. And so I think they're going to feel a little, call it disenfranchised by us doing this early.
Yeah, they definitely will. But at the same time, it really depends on how much information we get from those test takers on Saturday and Tuesday. And to be honest, because of the problems that occurred on Saturday, the information that we've gotten on the first couple of days is at times spotty.
Yeah.
We'll cover that. That disruption disrupted everything. We were actually in really great shape up until the point that it occurred. And after that, things really kind of got mixed up. But the one piece of good news is no matter which day you take this test, whether you're taking a makeup, is the fact that you will get your scores back on the same day as was previously announced. And that is Wednesday, May 18th. And that would be at 9 a.m. Eastern time. So taking a later test won't delay your score. And that's the one piece of good news that comes out of this.
Yeah, that is good news. Provided, obviously, you have a writing sample submitted and approved and that nothing actually happens during your next attempt if you're a makeupper. That could somehow delay things. But if all goes to plan, everybody gets scores on the 18th.
All right. So just for a moment, since we're in the LSAT world and not in the April LSAT disaster world, what's the test situation that we have on the horizon here?
Well, I'll just touch on the next 2. The next exam, we get this month of May off, blessedly. But the next exam is coming in June. The dates of that test are June 10th and 11th, a Friday and Saturday. I strongly suspect they're going to add another day, probably Tuesday, which would be the 13th, 14th. Math is not my strong suit with tequila in my hand.
14th.
If you're not registered for June, but it sounds appealing, I have bad news. The registration closed on April 27th, so it is too late to take that June test, with an exception. If you were one of the people whose test got interrupted here in April, one of the things that they offered was the ability to transfer into June, even past the registration deadline. So another concession that I thought was, sadly well-deserved. After June, we hit August, so another month off in between. July is a LSAT-less month. The August test, scheduled right now for the 12th and 13th, Friday and Saturday. Again, I think that'll be big enough they add a day. The registration for that test is still open. That test ends on May 12th, or that's the deadline that night at midnight. So if you're thinking about taking a test after June, into the summer, early fall, sign up for August. It's going to be a big one. I think it'll be a good one. June scores come out June 30th. August scores come out August 31st.
Yeah, and then recently they've just released all the registration and test dates and details for the exams of the second half, meaning all the tests through June of 2023. And one comment I'll make here that I've been seeing people online talking about, they keep asking, when are we going back to in-person? Well, at least as far as we know, we're not. And they have said that the test in its current format, which means these 4 sections, 3 of which are scored, tests taken at home using ProctorU as your online proctoring service, that is your test format into 2024. So I realize some people are thinking, it's terrible with all these problems. I want to go in person. Are they going to do that? Is August in person? It is not. It is online at home. Maybe we'll touch on that a little bit more when we talk about some of the problems that we had. But I will just remind everybody that online testing has problems. So does in person.
Yeah, we won't get too far back into the early days of the digital LSAT when they were still doing it on tablets in a proctored room. But it was far from, free of issues.
Oh, yeah. There were plenty of issues with it. So after that, one of the things you said, Jon, was that we have May off. No, we don't. We have it off from the LSAT, but we've got some webinars coming up, especially one that you and I will be involved in. On May 10th, we've got a basic conditional reasoning webinar coming up that is free. You can register at powerscore.com/free seminars. And then for you and I, what we consider to be the main event, and that is the Crystal Ball for the June LSAT. And that is on May 24th, which is a Tuesday. That will be 8 p.m. Eastern. I'm already feeling fired up about it. So
yeah, I think we've got a lot of good new stuff to talk about. And we'll touch on the crystal ball that we did for this April test as well.
Yeah, we'll come back because we received a number of comments from students who took this test this past weekend about that crystal ball.
We have.
And we'll convey some of those. Let's get into it then.
Let's do it. You already mentioned the first thing that I'll reiterate, which is, again, regardless of when you took the April test or when you will take the April test potentially, you will get your scores May 18th. Everybody gets them the same time. They start coming out right around 9 a.m. Eastern. So I know for us, we tend to wake up to just a bucket load of news from people who've gotten their scores. You're sometimes up at 6 a.m. our time. I sometimes am too.
I'm sometimes up earlier. I've been known to send a tweet at 4 in the morning when people are starting the LSAT, which is bad for me and my health.
I worry about you sometimes.
Shouldn't be up that early. Let's talk about this April LSAT, which originally was scheduled over Friday, Saturday, and Tuesday. And the way they had this, set out was that Friday, the 29th, was going to be about 3,800 people taking it. Maybe a little bit less with the melt that they often get prior to these exams. People wake up and they're like, I don't feel well, I don't want to take the test, or I'm just not in the mood for the LSAT. Or they change their life plans and they're not going to law school anymore. So we think that probably what happened on that Friday. On Saturday, the 30th, they were looking at about 4,000 test takers. We really don't know the final number. Once the massive technical outage occurred, LSAC went silent. They stopped communicating numbers and updates, primarily because they were focused on trying to fix the problem, number one, and then number two, come up with the various options. So I wasn't complaining that they weren't telling me how many people were finishing the test because I was like, you got a bigger, higher priority job. Go worry about that, which they did. But we know it was less than 4,000. And then on Tuesday, the 3rd, they expected about 400 to 500 people for the accommodated tests with paper and pencil, as well as the international exams, which we'll cover tonight as well. And we know that because they allowed some people to retake the Saturday test on Tuesday, we know the number was higher than originally expected. So again, we don't know the exact numbers because they were focused elsewhere. And then finally, we've got these new makeups on the 7th, as well as the scheduled makeup on the 10th, which now is bigger than it was before.
Sure.
We're not really sure how many people are in those, maybe 1,000. Hard to really say. But overall, you ended up with, around 9,000, somewhere in the middle of 9,000 who were registered. There's always a attrition rate right prior to the test. So we know that somewhere over 8,000 people are ultimately going to test. But what that means is this is a very small test. It's bigger than February and March, but it is still relatively small. When we think about 8,000 or even 8,500 test takers, compare that to some of these bigger administrations that are in the 20,000s. And you can automatically see the relative count here is there's just not as many people taking this exam as the big administrations that we run into.
Yeah, it doesn't change. A strange year, in fact, numerically speaking.
Yeah, it really has been. There are too many LSATs to start the year. Having one in January, February, March, and April is too much. Next year, they've dropped March, so we only have 3, but 4 in a row, month after month, they all ended up being really small and a lot of work for, I think, overall very small return. But I will say this, just because your test is smaller, that doesn't mean anything about its difficulty. It doesn't make it easier or harder. The test isn't changed. They don't try any weirder things on it. It's another LSAT. It's just that this is a smaller group of test takers.
Yeah, I get that question a lot, as I know you do too. Should I worry about these small tests or should I worry about these giant tests? Is there something that is a unique feature of those based on head count? And the answer happily is no.
No. Let's talk about unique features, or maybe not so unique features.
I knew that was your pivot. Nicely done.
So let's talk about how this experience was, because Friday wasn't too bad. And a lot of times when you see test issues, it's on the first day. Something's changed in some settings or the servers or what have you. But Friday went just fine. It was a really smooth day overall. There's always a few issues with connectivity or proctors, being uncool, what have you. But as far as a systemic larger issue, there was no problem. So when we woke up on Saturday, the thought was, this is going to be fine. The first day went well. The second day should go well also. And several hours into the start of the test, we started to see that there was a problem. And essentially, people were being kicked out of the test experience. Someone might be 2 sections in or 3 sections in, or sometimes nearing the end of the test, and all of a sudden, they're gone. The test closes down and they're kicked out. And for people who are waiting to start the test, all of a sudden, they can't get in to start the test. And as it turns out, that's a really big distinction because some people saw content and some people didn't, and that changed the outcome of what they could do in terms of retake dates.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, this was down for about 3 hours. And just like last October when we had something very similar occur, it looks like it was related to some type of, server problem that had occurred. We had pop-ups last time, which I think was a setting change elsewhere. So maybe I'm thinking about a different outage, which, by the way, is bad news. If I get the outages on the LSAT mixed up, that's usually not really what I consider to be a good thing,
when there's too many to keep track of.
Was that October that was really the problem?
Awry. You were right. Though. It was October 2021 where it feels very deja vu. Like this was almost an identical issue for almost an identical period of time. The only big difference that I could tell is this wasn't the first time it happened, and there weren't nearly as many people trying to get into the system as there were in October.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, back in October, Microsoft Azure had a problem.
That's exactly what it was.
In one of their regions that caused everybody to go down. I don't know the exact problem this time. I think, just because of the communication they were doing, I haven't had a whole lot of time to address it, and I've been kind of busy. But we know that hundreds and hundreds of people were affected, most likely over 1,000. And as we've said many times before on this podcast, if even one person is affected adversely by technical conditions or test conditions or what have you, it's its own kind of disaster for that person. It's catastrophic to them. And after spending months and months preparing, paying hundreds of dollars for this, and then to have the inability to take the test when you're really ready for it is frustrating. There were some people who, sent me messages that said, this might actually be a good thing because I didn't study enough. So now I have another couple days. But I'm not counting, that for the typical person. They've, circled that on the calendar that this is my test day. They're focused on it. And this turns into something that is just an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, compounded too by the fact that, and I hate to really beat this horse, but the student support services that often happen in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophe like this leave a lot to be desired. I'll put it that way. I don't think this was handled nearly as well as it could have been, which of course only compounds the frustration. And the fear, frankly, people are terrified when things go wrong because in many ways, the rest of their life depends on this going correctly.
Yeah, it has a huge impact. And this won't help future test takers who run into a problem, but maybe someone will have listened to this and they'll keep this in mind the next time there's an issue, because I say it all the time. When a problem occurs, it more or less catches them unawares. And so when they start getting people on the phone, the people on the phone don't really know what to do. They're not aware that anything's happening other than, hey, this person's calling me with an issue. Well, they get that on the regular basis. And so what immediately started happening was the people on the phone would say, there's only 2 options for you to retake, May 3rd and May 10th. And they weren't lying. Those were the 2 options that they had in front. If somebody got knocked out of the test on, say, Saturday, and it was just a random occurrence, those were the 2 options those people would have. So they were telling people this, and I was saying, well, that's the unofficial word. And I always say that because the phone people are, in some cases, the last people to know. And that was the point where, Jon, I started agitating, both by sending messages to my contacts at LSAC and, kind of posting it online to make it even more vitriolic and public, was you really need to add a Saturday test date. You've got people taking the exam today who can't take it on Tuesday or the following Tuesday. Do the right thing. And I knew they wanted to because they communicated that immediately, like, we're working on it. But they can't commit to it because they have to talk to ProctorU to see whether or not they have the capacity for enough proctors to do this again. I understand. It's not like they can say it immediately, but they go silent instead of doing what I would say, which is we're looking at our options.
Right.
We'll update you soon. And so, Jon, to some extent, I'm going to send them a bill for doing their customer service because you and I sat around and communicated repeatedly to people saying, hey, there'll probably be an update. We think this is what they're going to do, but we don't have an official word on it. We know it's being looked at. You and I end up being the de facto customer service, and I want to get paid for that.
Yeah, put my routing number on that invoice too, by the way, because we were both pretty outspoken immediately on Saturday, not only trying to communicate with students and clarify what was otherwise an absence of communication. Be patient. They're going to figure this out. It takes a little while on the back end. The fact that you're not hearing anything is sadly par for the course with these guys a lot of times. But also, you said agitating, and I think that's exactly what it was. We were both quite outspoken in their direction of like, this is the right thing to do. You need to add a Saturday. And it took them a day and a half, but they eventually did.
They did finally listen to our kind of like beseeching implorations to them. And they added that Saturday, the 7th, to that. And that was only the fair thing to do, given that it was a Saturday test. And so that gave everybody a couple different options. However, not everybody had the same options. And I think it's useful to kind of like deconstruct the way that this works. Because if you see content during the test, they now have a problem because they have these tests all scheduled out in a certain way. And so people who saw content automatically couldn't take it on Tuesday the 3rd. They had to be kicked either to Saturday the 7th or Tuesday the 10th. That is a conscious decision by LSAC. They're like, we cannot have you see this because you might see the same content again, and we can't have that.
Yeah, the tests for Saturday were also scheduled to be reused again on Tuesday the 3rd. So they just couldn't afford any kind of like content overlap on the same person.
And you might say to yourself, well, they can just give me different sections. That's a really big kind of like information juggling problem at that point, because you're like trying to take this test taker and say, don't get this test, don't get this test. They just don't have time for that. And so they just kick them all to the 7th or the 10th. However, if you didn't get in to see any content, what they would allow is for you to take any of those 3 days.
Yeah.
And there were some, various kind of variations on that. And I will say this, I had a student and then heard from a few more who actually got kicked out of the test. And they had asked me, what do I do? I said, stay on the line, try to get back in. If the outage ends soon and you can get back in within, say, an hour or two, they'll let you finish the test. And amazingly, some of those people are actually able to finish it. So as catastrophic as it is to get kicked out and then just kind of lose momentum, at least for some people, they were able to finish and they felt pretty good about the performance. They didn't lose time on it and they were able to go back and finish. But you can kind of see how this works and why we're able to talk about the test now, because we know that the upcoming Saturday and Tuesday tests will not be the same content.
Yeah, 100% differentiation between what's happened and what's still going to. Which is, again, why we're in the clear to do this. It's funny you mentioned that about the delays, though, because it's such an awkward position, this purgatory mid-test, because you just don't know. Is it going to be 15 minutes? Is it going to be an hour, 2 hours? At what point are they going to tell me I can't wait any longer and have to schedule a makeup? There's just so much uncertainty that happens in real time. Man, I feel for these people. We gave the best advice we could, but so much of it's psychologically individualized at that point that it's hard even for us to know what the right decision is sometimes.
And I had a ton of people messaging me who were like, thanks for helping. And I'm like,
me too.
Doing the best I can do. I wish this hadn't happened to you. And it's terrible that it happened, but maybe we can get through this. And in a lot of cases, they were able to kind of navigate the situation. And that's why we post a lot. We talk to a lot of students when that happens. It's kind of like we go from calm and casual and kind of just paying attention, but not, having to be uptight or worry about it, to like high alert, red alert kind of scenario. I will mention one other weird issue that happened, and that was that some people posted that they had gotten PDFs of their answers and needed to submit them. And they were like, is this fake? Is this legit? Because of the nature of the outage, those were actually legitimate circumstances. If there's a test disconnection, the test apparently will download a PDF of sorts that's highly encrypted.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to be like, these were my answers. You don't have the reader for it, and it's not like some simple encryption. But if that happens and there's like a slight lag, the directions actually pop up. And when you come back online, it says, hey, upload this. So if you got that message, and there were a few people who did, it was legitimate. If you uploaded your answers, it did in fact work. It was just a matter of the connectivity to the exam being restored. So once they had that, it worked that way. I had never heard of that issue. Apparently it happens maybe once or twice in a typical test administration, but the nature of this one caused it to happen a few more times. But that's something for the files for the future when someone's like, I got a PDF and I don't know what to do with it. I'm like, follow directions and upload it. It's legit.
It's legit. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that. I had kind of forgotten about that part, lost in the chaos of all the rest.
Yeah, indeed. All right. So let's get into test content. This is, really the fun part. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to it. But I will say, as usual, there's a series of disclaimers that I am going to go through. I'm going to try to go through it really fast because I want to get to the test stuff. And there's so many different tests. This could take a little bit of time. So remember that we're going to talk about the test content that is out there. It is not in use any longer, so it is kind of like free to discuss. And then we're going to make scale predictions for the various test forms that are out there. So a couple disclaimers. First off, this is all public knowledge that we're pulling from. Yeah, we have some private knowledge about it, but we piece it together based upon public knowledge and then fill in the gaps based upon our database, which goes back decades now. I will also remind people that the order that you had of your test, your section order, does not mean that that's the only section order that's being used that way. I saw some people talking about LR1 and LR4, for example. You might have had one section in LR1 and someone else had it in LR4. The sections and the orders change all day long. Talking about section order is not actually useful or interesting in terms of the test content or what you saw. Like, my first LR was super difficult. Right. Another person would be like, mine was easy. That's because you didn't have the same, first LR. Another thing when we talk about test difficulty, for the real LSAT, it almost always feels worse than when you're taking a practice test. And there's a negativity bias that will creep into your recollections. And that's because this is the real thing. The pressure is on, and this score goes down on your so-called permanent record, even though that record is only 5 years of permanence. And when we talk about difficulty, sometimes we'll say this was relatively easy. We still mean it's difficult. It's just on the easier side of hard. I've said this many times before. I think every LSAT section is challenging and difficult. So this is a relative level of difficulty where the bar is already really high. Also remember, and we didn't see that as much this time, but maybe a little bit, that the test makers are actively attempting to confuse you by placing the same topics in multiple sections. So if you saw a certain topic, and I'll use one of my favorite, which is Nigeria, a real example from a recent test, or speeding, or music, or planets, and then someone else mentions that topic, oh, I had Nigeria, don't automatically assume it's the same. We have seen them intentionally try to confuse test takers by having similar topics on different RC passages, for example, or different games or different LR. This has been happening for a while, and it's a known tactic that they use that we have identified, and it is absolutely certain that it's intentional, in our opinion. All right, there's another thing about the way we estimate real and experimental sections, and that's actually going to come into play tonight, Jon, because there is some uncertainty out there. These are based on certain assumptions that we know about reusage, namely that if a section was scored in a prior manner, that it won't come back as an experimental. And sometimes we'll make kind of judgments that we think something's real based upon its prior use as an experimental. So be aware of that. It's also going to be possible, especially tonight, that you don't hear your section below, or that you don't even recall the questions that are mentioned. That's something that does happen. People forget. They almost have a blackout during the LSAT of sorts, where it's just like, I don't remember this whole thing, or it all runs together in a big waterfall. And this is a lot harder these days because information is so limited online. Especially this test had a lot of information problems because the technical problem stopped people from talking about the exam, and then the noise of them talking about it, and I mean that not in a negative way, kind of like overwhelmed people talking about the various tests. And we use some of that information to cross-reference what we're looking at. So this made it tough for us. If people don't send us information or give us test recaps or share that kind of broad information, we don't want specific information, it becomes more challenging. I think Jon would agree with me in saying this was a very challenging test.
This was rough.
Almost at the end. All right. One or two final disclaimers. The first one being, please do not summarize this podcast online. We've seen this happen before. The summaries often miss a lot of nuance. They don't talk about some of the uncertainties that we talk about. They usually put it down as like, this is black and white, and sometimes it's not. And we'd really prefer that people hear what we said directly. If they don't want to hear our conversation about tequila or music or what have you, that's fine. That's why we put timestamps on our podcast. They can go right to where we talk about their specific test structure. All right. So I think that's pretty much it. I've already talked about how difficult it was to collect information. Yeah. Let's start with one of the smaller tests. And I think you want to kind of do this in order of test size.
That seems to make sense. Yeah, let's ramp our way up here. And we'll start with what I think was probably the smallest group of test takers, which are the paper and pencil accommodated students who tested on Tuesday, yesterday, the 3rd.
Yeah, and we're going to cover them, the international test takers, and then the regular takers from Friday, Saturday, and Tuesday as well. So we've got a couple groups.
Let's talk about this paper test from yesterday, and it's a pretty easy one to talk about, which is good news, because they reused a test that we are very familiar with. Specifically, they reused the content from the October 2020 LSAT that was given here in North America. Or at least they reused certain sections from that test, the games, the reading comp, and one of the logical reasonings from it.
Yeah, and usually when they do this, if they reuse one test, everybody who took the accommodated paper and pencil test gets the same exam. Because of all the noise about retakes, we didn't hear a whole lot from these test takers, and I personally didn't have anybody taking the test with these accommodations. So we didn't really kind of get the usual level of information. We just know that some people for sure had this test. Probably all of the paper and pencil people did, but if not, let us know, and we can make an adjustment in the records that we have.
This is the only test that was on paper that I'm aware of, but again, it's a limited group to begin with. And like you say, a lot of it was drowned out in the chaos of other things. If you took the original October 2020, they would clearly make an exception for you here and give you something else. They never want to repeat a test. But for those of you who did get this particular set of content, let's run through it, and then we'll give you a scale prediction towards the end. Let's start with the games. The real games from that test, and again, given yesterday, the 3rd, were these 4. There was one about a furniture sale. There was a game about artists, a game about people visiting. It was a conference and visiting 3 cities, London, Madrid, and Paris. And then finally a game about books on a bookshelf. So if one or all of those sound familiar to you from yesterday or from Tuesday, those were real. And it was a fairly middle-of-the-road section. We said the same thing back in our October 2020 recap, which is podcast episode 68, for anyone who wants to revisit.
Yeah, if you want to go back and hear a little bit more extended discussion of this particular test section and all the sections from this, episode 68 is the place to go.
Yeah, we've already got these details in the vault, so I'm not going to rehash them too much here. But those were the games from that test.
Yeah, and the reading comp on that test was, I think, a kind of challenging section as we'll see here, but it's covered Edmonia Lewis, workplace ethics, suburban sprawl, a passage that a lot of people have complained about, and then shrubs and hedges. So those were your 4 topics there. And again, those were real, those were scored. And then we get into logical reasoning. And at least the logical reasoning they seem to be using that was scored yesterday included questions on Thai versus Italian food, rat fleas, a skin disorder with cancer, and medications. And so we think that was the scored section that everybody got. From a standpoint of how the scoring scale looks on this test, let's talk just for a moment about how we do that, and then I won't have to repeat it when we get to the other tests because we're going to go through scoring scales for each one of these. There's more to this podcast today than I've actually anticipated, Jon.
Yeah.
I forgot there were all these different tests for us.
It's a real onion.
Yeah. Hopefully there's no tears at the end for us.
We'll see.
We start at -7 as the baseline. You can miss 7 questions, and that would yield a score of 170. So that is our standard baseline for all LSATs. And then what we do is based upon sectional difficulty, we either make no adjustment, or we tighten it by 1, or we loosen it by 1. We've never had a situation where we loosen it by 2 yet. I'm sure there'll be a day when that happens, though. Mm-hmm. So you could miss 7 questions to get a 170 at the start of this. When we look at the logic games, we feel like that section does not move the scale. So based upon the real logic games, you're still at -7. However, the reading comprehension does move the scale. That suburban sprawl, hedges, kind of like ending there is a tough one. We think that loosens the scale from 7 questions to 8. So literally it adds 1 to the scale. So now you could miss 8 questions to get a 170. That's loosening it. It's better for test takers. It's a compensation versus the difficulty of the test. And then finally with the LR, we don't see any movement at all there, which means that for the accommodated paper and pencil test takers on Tuesday, your scaling is you can miss 8 questions and that would yield a 170. And then that usually translates up and down the scale and gives you a sense of like how many questions you could miss for other points.
Yeah. And one additional thing, and we can move on, I think, which is that everyone I've heard from, which is you could count them on one hand, very small group of paper test takers had experimental logical reasoning. We're obviously discounting that section. So if you recognize the Thai and Italian food and the rat fleas and the cancer medication, skin disorder, then that was your real section. You can ignore the other one.
Fantastic. All right. So that is the accommodated section, probably the smallest group here.
Yeah.
Let's now go to the international test takers because they got a different test.
Yes, they did. We started hearing about this early Tuesday morning, early our time Tuesday morning, as people wrapped up their tests overseas. And here's what we saw. It was another one, and again, this is fortunate, that we were able to match pretty quickly to a test that we were familiar with already. So the paper and pencil people, they got October 2020. The international people, at least by and large, got October 2019. That LSAT, which has been used again since more than once, I believe, but certainly the most prominent repeat of that test was for the April 2021 LSAT Flex, one of the last LSAT Flexes.
Which means we've then recapped that in episode 83 of the podcast. So
exactly right.
We'll cover it very quickly here, but if you're like, I want to hear more about this, go back to that episode 83, and we'll break it down in even more detail. And it was funny because when this test started out, I was up much earlier than you on Tuesday.
Yes, you were.
Because I had board meetings to deal with, and I was like trying to do 2 things at once. Deal with the meeting and send you a message. Like, I saw Uruguay, and I was like, yes, I know at least where the logic games on this test came from.
You impress me quite often, Dave, but that was actually a highlight moment. I don't know, it's going to get too much better in the week. You'd identified the test before I even woke up while you're presenting in board meetings. I don't know how in the world.
Multitasking, man.
I'm convinced you've trained your daughter to do some of this or something.
It would be nice. I wish she showed an interest in this, but she's much more interested in drawing and other things.
There you go. Well, let's talk about that October 2019 test, the April 2021 Flex, this week's international. And I'll start with logic games. These were the 4 games as they appeared on that test. 23 questions, games about attorneys and cases. I think it was assigning cases to people at a law firm. It was presentations at a book club, bookstore employees stocking shelves. This was a tough game, and various shifts, I think, for the shelving. And then finally, travel guides, giving tours in Uruguay and Venezuela over 3 months, January through March. Another hard game.
Yeah, the last 2 games there being pretty challenging. So, interesting section overall. The first 2 games, for a lot of people, not that difficult, though. So this is where you have to kind of like make some assessments of like how hard were those last 2 games compared to how much more straightforward the first 2 games were. But we'll come back to that momentarily. Then you had the reading comprehension, which had traced back. We can trace that back into June of 2018, where they first used it as an experimental. And then they debuted it on October 2019, just a little more than a year later, as a real section. And this was 27 questions. You had a passage on jazz and Latin. You had a passage that gets described in so many different ways, but I always think about it as like ice cores. Mm-hmm. It's about volcanoes and glaciers, sulfur in Indonesia, ice cores drilling, just a whole lot of different ideas in there. That is a tough science passage.
Yeah, that was hard.
Then you have a passage I'm looking forward to reading at some point, which is about motorcyclists and camping and park managers in Banff, a place that I've never been, but is on my list of high interest.
It's really postcard pretty. That's all I know about it.
Lake Louise right there, and there's that super hotel I want to stay at that I can't remember the name of. It's probably like Banff Hotel or something.
Might be the Banff Inn.
It's that or Lake Louise Hotel, I'm sure. I'm probably wrong. Anyway, the last passage is a comparative one about intellectual property and ownership. The Banff passage, not that tough, whereas the IP passage at the end is rather difficult, and so not an easy section at all. And then, Jon, we got into some LR uncertainty. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Give me the uncertainty, huh?
Yes,
fair enough.
100%.
Well, this was tricky. And again, we can, I think, cage it in the preface that you gave, which is we're only as good as the information we get. And this was a place where we just didn't get a whole lot of information. It also made it difficult that despite them using content from previous tests that we already knew about for games and for reading comp, they didn't do that, as far as I can tell, with logical reasoning. This was not logical reasoning from that original October 2019 test or from the April 2021 reuse. So it makes it a lot harder to identify. That aside, here's what we've got. There was one section, 25 questions, that had questions about snow mountain monkeys and I think apples. There was a question about soybeans, a question about France and North America having about the same fat consumption, but then France has a lower heart disease incidence. Side note, reminds me of one of my all-time favorite LSAC questions about the French paradox. It's in our course. I love that question. I know you know it.
I do know it because it's about wine.
It's about wine. I don't know if this one had anything about wine in it, but it was about fat consumption and how the French are winning. Rat size and risk were bigger rats. Rats have smaller risk than smaller rats. And estrogen was a question in there, gravitational forces and the structure of the sun. And then a question in that section about fishing boats. So there you go. From what I can tell, this was a section that all international people seemed to get. So whether they had 2 LRs with this and something else, this seemed to be the unified section for all people, which makes me think it's real.
Yeah, I think it's real as well. It is also the point where some of the students that had the second LR section in there, we had a hard time here because this is where there was a lot of international test takers are obviously distributed into different time zones. They often start the test earlier than you and I are up, and they're often finished and really kind of like out of the circuit, so to speak, by the time we're really kind of powered up and fully running. So we didn't get a whole lot of information about this. This was, I think, we felt very good about the RC and the LG, and when we got to the LR, we're like, there's not a whole lot of clarity here. We're getting a lot of information on one section. We can see some of the questions in there having common themes to other ones. We really think this is the real section, although based upon some of the discussions that I had with students, it almost will not matter from a scaling standpoint. Yeah. Both the LRs that were floating around seem to be about the same level of difficulty. So possibly 3 LRs that were floating around. All the international people that I talked to, I think for the most part, at least the most predominant section construction was 2 LRs. Seemed to be a lot of logical reasoning experimentals overseas. So let's look at the matrix then and kind of break it down based upon that LR that we just talked about being real. Again, we start at -7 to get a 170. You can miss 7 questions for 170. The logic games about the attorneys, book club, shelves, travel tours in Venezuela and Uruguay. That's a really medium section. Remember, we're very conservative when we do this. Sections, we're going to say that that does not have an effect. However, the jazz, volcanoes, motorcyclists, Banff, intellectual property, RC section, that also has an effect. Like the prior test that we're looking at, that will move it from 7 to 8. And then no matter which LR was scored for your test, as far as we can tell, but again, we think that snow mountain monkeys and soybeans section was the real one. We find that one reasonable and having no impact. So ultimately, maybe it's the case where, you know, if the RC isn't a perfect kind of loosening of it, the LG makes it so it moves it by 1. I think when we've talked about this before, Jon, we've said that neither the RC nor LG alone is enough to move it, but together it should. So no matter whether you call it 0 and 1 or 0.5 and 0.5, you still end up with -8 to get a 170 for all international test takers.
Yeah. Again, you mentioned we're conservative, and I cannot stress that point enough. I think if we're wrong here, which I doubt, it would probably be a -9, not a -7. I think basically when we've discussed this test before, October 2019 and April 2021, what we said about the games in the RC is that neither one of them probably is hard enough to be a full point of scale movement, but collectively it's very likely they could be a greater than a single point of scale movement. It's hard to say.
And that would actually, the way that plays out is if it is so-called greater than a point, usually it means the scores in the 170s don't move by more than 1.
Right.
It's the scores that are downscale, like into the 160s, the 150s that have more looseness. This is where it gets difficult. It's why we use 170 as such a benchmark, because the movement up there is less and it's easier to understand high-level difficulty when we analyze this. Mid-level difficulty is much more nuanced to actually see. So when we say, hey, it could be more than 1, that might loosen the scale at 160, whereas it didn't loosen it more than 1 at 170.
Yeah. So, and again, concession to those games. It's funny, I think sometimes when we talk about these international tests that I almost wish I could hear the responses so that I could learn some like curse words in other languages. I'm sure people were a little disappointed to hear that Shelves game wasn't a guaranteed point.
I remember the response well. I know a few international curse words, but we're going to keep those out of the podcast.
Yeah. It's a different episode.
Sure is. It's a different podcast.
Yes, it is. So -8 at a 170, but if you're talking about this maybe loosening it a little more going down, let me just hit a couple of destination points through the 160s and see if I can't maybe give people a flavor of what we think would happen there as well. For instance, I think a 165 here, you could probably miss 13. For 160, I suspect you could miss 19. And for 155, I suspect you could miss as many as 28 to hit those numbers. So a little more generous down the scale, I think.
Yeah, so the way to figure that out is to take those 3 real sections and then start tabulating the number of questions that you think you might have missed. Best case scenario, worst case scenario. And that'll start to help give you a score range, which allows you to assess, where should I be here? And we've talked about that elsewhere. I think you should do that for every single practice test. You should never score a practice test without first sitting down and thinking, how did I perform? And try to calibrate your perception with the reality of what is actually happening.
Yeah, I'll take you one further and say I don't think you should ever even do a single question without having that inner dialogue. How do I think I did here? Let's estimate this on a scale of like confidence, because if your confidence is too high or too low, you've got some calibrating to do.
Yeah, although everybody answers the question thinking often they got it right. But
I don't know.
Mostly, if you're doing it, you're like, when you got it right, or you feel like you got it right versus you're uncertain. Most people come out of a question, they're like, I don't know what happened there. Or they're like, I got that.
Definitely D. Yeah.
Yeah. But the I got it and then you didn't is the worst moment, because you're like, I just counted something that didn't. But if you're going to do this at a broad level, you should do it at the granular level as well.
100%.
That's a conversation for another day. Let's move on to the main event. That's the domestic LSAT that was primarily given on Friday and Saturday, and then also given on Tuesday to people who started to retake. And we see more section variation in terms of what we have here. So, well, let's dive into it, because once again, early on, we were able to get a pretty good sense of what we were looking at. Both Friday and Saturday, I was up early and had a good idea of what was occurring. And then you were up pretty shortly thereafter, and we both were in agreement on what we were seeing here.
Yeah, I was proud of both of us, but me in particular. So
I got up early, raised my hand.
This is Saturday. One of the things that I think helped us ease into Friday morning is the games that we saw them start using as the single scored game section that morning came from a test that we were familiar with. Specifically, they were the games taken from the November 2020 LSAT. And these were those 4 games. And again, these are real. So if you saw these games, they counted. There was a game in there about spices or herbs, as some people have put it, parsley, sage, a few other things. A game about film festivals, movies and theaters assigned at certain times. A game about music lessons, piano and violin. And then finally a game about an antique auction with furniture, presumably.
Yeah, and for a lot of people, that was their only section of games. So they knew right away that it was real. We did see another game section later on, and that section was... I think the first 2 games weren't that bad. There was a couple of different, ways I heard those games described, but the 3rd and 4th games were actually relatively notable. The 3rd game was about pet clinics and kind of like grooming and training services and veterinary procedures. This was not an easy game. And then the 4th game is one that I definitely want to do. It's about racehorses and racetracks. I think over a series of months.
Yeah.
And so those were the 2 notable, but that was real as well. And we started to see that really on Saturday a little bit after the meltdown. And that's where we were getting a lot of noise and kind of like crosstalk, and made it a little bit harder to kind of like get into that section. But it seems to me that fewer people had this second section and a lot more people had the first section. Not that that makes a difference, but those were the two scored sections that were used over the past weekend.
Yeah, it's funny. Usually when people aren't terribly clear or specific about the games that they saw, like the first couple in that section you just outlined with the pet clinics and the horses, it means that they were so generic as to hardly register. So I heard people saying things like, I think it was about speeches, or was it presentations? Or it might have been about job applicants. It's like those are all such just default go-to subjects that they just kind of evaporate as soon as you've done it.
Yeah, it's the standard type of game, like six people into 6 spaces, 7 into 7 spaces, that kind of thing where you're like, okay, I've seen this a million times. I just have to go through it and do it. It's not notable, and you're not really thinking about topics so much. And then later on, you run into something that's harder, and you're like, you stare at it a little bit more. You're thinking about it. It soaks into your conscious a little bit more.
Yeah, it stays with you. But of those 8 games that we just described, 2 sections, all real. That's all that I saw for this entire test. I didn't see any experimental games come up domestically. See what happens over the next several days of this. But so far, I haven't seen any experimental games, just those 8 that we mentioned.
Yeah, so if you're listening to this and you had other games or other sections besides these 2, let us know, because we'd certainly be interested in that. Let's go to RC, though, because when we started out on Friday, pretty much everybody had 2 reading comprehension sections. And so one of the most common questions we were being asked and that we saw was, which one's real?
Yeah, at least through the first half, maybe 2/3 of the day, everybody seemed to get double reading comp, experimental reading comp, which, as long as that's happening and they're always a pair, makes it very difficult for us to distinguish real from unscored, unless one of the sets is from a test where it's been scored previously. And in this case, no.
And the confirmation that we've gotten on the last test or 2 from the Tuesday test takers, that was kind of lost because, again, you had so many kind of like retakers due to the technical issue showing up. So this made it difficult. But let me go through these 2 sections that a lot of people had and then talk about why we think a certain one is real and we feel very confident about it. So the first of the 2 sections covered a couple different topics, obviously. One of the topics was about Lillian Hellman, an author, and a discussion of melodrama versus satire. Another is a passage about the 1700s Cascadia earthquake and tsunamis in Japan. So really, a lot of people called it earthquake or earthquake tsunami. There's one about group brainstorming. Is it good or bad? That's your comparative. And then the last passage about awarding damages, tangible versus intangible losses. That was all one section, 27 questions. The other section that people had that paired with for reading comp, so they knew automatically one of these 2 was real and the other was experimental, had a really interesting passage about experimental rock music like the Beatles and traditional chorus and verse versus storytelling songs. You can see McCartney being a real storyteller in his songs. So
I think Hey Jude was actually one of the songs used in it.
There you go, yeah. Original artists not being compensated on the resale of their art and how the laws work with resale and artist royalties, something I'd be interested in reading. And then medical ethics, about doctors lying to patients. That was the comparative passage. And then finally, depression and its causes. Another passage about serotonin, which was a favorite topic of the test from the 1990s, not the PT 90s, the actual decade of the 90s. Serotonin used to be a real big topic on this test. This was also 27 questions. And so there was not any later confirmation where somebody had one section or the other to say that had to be real. So how do we make the determination of which was which? Well, the first passage set, the one with the earthquake and tsunami and Hellman and brainstorming, this has been used several times as an experimental section. It was used in the September 2018 exam. It was used in the October 2018 Asia International exam. And usually what happens is sections that are trialed out as experimental once or two times eventually come back as real. And so we think this is the real section. This has been used repeatedly. It has been battle tested. I think they have enough data now to say it is a real section. And by comparison, the other section, there's really no information on it. It looks like a new trial. So that would really kind of set you up to think this is newly in use. We haven't really seen it before. So that second section about experimental music, the royalties, the medical ethics, the depression and serotonin and so forth, that would be the experimental section. That was also the easier of the two sections. So I know for a lot of people, that's not great news.
Yeah, now we'd be hearing swear words in English. It's certainly disappointing. I will say, to clarify a little bit, when we make this distinction, it's not confirmed. We just have a really, really strong hunch. And it's in particular that Cascadia earthquake passage. That's the one that we see repeated over and over. And when that's happened before, as we saw in the March test, it is a very good indication that they're finally using it as something scored now.
Yeah, I don't think listeners would know this, but you and I, after we have days like Friday, we're like, okay, it wasn't confirmed. We obviously start making an assessment as to which one we think is real, hoping that it will later on be confirmed. And in every case so far, what we expected was going to be real turned out to be confirmed as real later on.
We ran into the same issue in March. We ran into the same issue in February. And the paper tests are what confirmed it in both cases. As we discussed, though, the paper test here didn't overlap with this, so...
No, and they're doing this intentionally to confuse. They put these two sections on with no way of telling until later. In this case, I think we have enough evidence that if I had to go to the great LSAC casino in the sky, I would be betting on this Hellman earthquake, brainstorming, etc. passage is real, and I'd feel very, very good about it. So I know it was the harder of the two. I'm sorry about that, but I would be willing to bet my money that that was real.
It was not the only real, and here's one we don't have to bet on because we know. There's a third section of reading comprehension that we saw. This first started coming out Friday afternoon, but appeared more over the weekend and certainly yesterday with the makeups. It had these 4 passages in it, and this, from what I saw, was always given as the only reading comp on this particular test form. There was a passage about Harlem and the African-American Renaissance art. I think there's a Spike Lee reference in there, which is interesting. A passage I'd love to read about European Union forests and fairy tales. There's a passage about acoustic law, the rule of law and judicial rules and things. That was your comparative passage in this set. And then finally, a science passage about club cells in fish skin and how they help to presumably protect against like bird predation. This was a tough section, but we do know this was real. So if you saw those passages, presumably you saw them as your only reading comp, you'd know they were real as well. And it was not an easy section, 27 questions, and people complained.
Which tells you a lot about reading comp these days. A lot of complaining about reading comp. You go back on multiple prior tests here, and every single time it's reading comp complaints. And they have just amped the difficulty up. The passages are impenetrable at times. The questions are nuanced, subtle, very difficult. Not everything. That's not saying all 4 passages are brutal. But the good news is for future test takers, if they are trialing out easier RC, you're likely to see a natural shift. And this happens. There's been LSAT periods in the past where the logic games was just rough every single time. Then it was LR was rough every single time. Now we're seeing RC being rough every single time. I think it's very easy for them to make RC difficult. And so they have turned it up right now because I think students have gotten better at logic games and better at logical reasoning. The tools for the preparation there are just at a higher level overall.
Yeah. There's one final thing I'll say about this real section of reading comp is, like that first set of games that we discussed, the spices, the music lessons, this also came from the November 2020 test. So even if we hadn't seen it as just single sections, we would have known this was real because it's been scored before. It was real in November of 2020.
All right, Jon, let's get into the logical reasoning where we have, again, some uncertainty in terms of what's happening. What I'll do is I'll just cover the first section that we know for a fact is real. We saw this on Friday. These were a lot of the test takers who had logic games and 2 reading comps and then 1 logical reasoning. And so consequently, we were able to prove demonstrably. And this was a section that had some, earlier difficulty. We saw some complaints about it, but the topics included traditional Japanese gardens, newspaper versus online book reviews and sales, casinos, a question I'd like to do, bypass roads, alcohol consumption and exercise.
That's a question.
Another good question, I'm sure, for you. Yeah. Calories on menus, something I'm wildly against. White tigers and cubs having a hard time surviving in the wild, kind of related to zoos and captivity. Commercial and residential home flooding insurance. something I've personally experienced.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charleston. And then regular stretching improves reaction times. Kind of cool section from the sound of, at least those questions that we have as highlights there.
Yeah, interesting range of topics. But we did see all of those in isolation as the single LR section. So we know those are real. And here's where things take a bit of a murky turn. I don't want to say that we are the biggest victims of the Saturday issues, Dave.
God, no.
That's a joke, obviously. It's hard to paint ourselves as really suffering at all much. But this was a place where I'm certain Saturday caused us problems.
For sure.
So let's get into some of the uncertainties here. I have some questions that I'm almost 100% on were experimental. Again, in the great LSAC casino, this is where my money goes. But a bit of grain of salt here. Some question topics that we do not believe counted. So if you can match these to your section and you had 2 LRs, then we think you can disregard this section.
Yeah, and I'll also add that it's very murky because of all the cross chatter. It was really tough for us. So it is possible that we mix some of this up. I'll just be blunt about it. We didn't get the kind of information that we often get, and a lot of these questions didn't match anything in the database. So if you're like, wait, that was wrong, send us a DM and tell us, I actually had this section, with these questions and so forth, so we have a better understanding of it. But I'll stop the interruption and let you continue.
No, that's fine. As long as people know we will never issue a retraction. And I'm fine. You will not get your money back.
We'll double down on the...
What's Dave Chappelle's line? He's like Evel Knievel. He just gets paid for the attempt. That's kind of
doesn't matter whether he gets across Snake Canyon.
Right. I don't have to land it. So here are some question topics that we believe are experimental. Under-energized employees, scientific journal and P variable, farmers and firefighters, employees and eligibility for paid vacation, and a couple more, possibly from a different experimental section, but I also think these were experimental. Blue and orange fruit, and then a 0.05 and 0.005 threshold, whatever that is. So I believe all of those are from unscored sections. If you can match them up and had 2 LRs, your other section, we believe, counted.
Exactly. And LR, always the toughest to identify to some extent. And when you have multiple sections, for the typical person, quite understandably, they mix the sections up. I've had people come back who I know are highly credible and tell me, yeah, this section contained these questions, this other section contained those. And then later on when the test was released, we're like, nope, you had it mixed up. It's a little of each. So recall after a stressful experience like the LSAT is already compromised. And then when you've got low information environment, a lot of people saying, even if they do talk about it, they don't want to get too specific. Remember, you're allowed to talk about topics. What they don't want you speculating on is specifics or what is real or what is not. But as we always tell people, if you tell us the topics, we'll figure out what's real because we have a ton of information that you can't access that we have access to. In this case, the technical meltdown really short-circuited the whole process, I think, and caused a ton of issues.
Yeah, it happened really when the LR experimentals were starting to get mostly distributed too. Had this happened on, say, Friday instead, I think it would have really caused problems with reading comp, which was the main experimental section that day.
Yeah, and there's fewer topics in reading comp, so we probably still would have picked up on the earthquakes passage.
I wish it
had
had happened on Friday.
Also, the way people describe, questions. If you're going to talk about planets, one person might call it that, another person might call it Pluto. And then you're like, well, which are we talking about the same question or not? And we may have an extensive amount of information on questions about Pluto, but planets, there may be dozens and dozens of questions where we see information. Then we don't know which one we're looking at. And that's a little bit of like a peek behind the curtain there as to like some of the problems that we face. Again, the problems that we face were nothing like those of the test takers who got kicked out of the experience. So we're not complaining. We're just kind of commenting on it.
Yeah. If anybody couldn't tell, it's sometimes tough with audio. I was being completely facetious when I said Dave and
I know you were.
Okay. So last thing, and then we'll get into the final scoring matrix, because I know that's why a lot of people are still with us here. Let's talk a little bit about the crystal ball that we did. We did one before the March and the April tests and really previewed what we expected to happen for both of those exams and got a lot of questions after the March test as to whether we would update it, change it for the April exam specifically. And we did not. We left it because we thought everything we said in that particular discussion would hold true through this week. I'm happy to report that it has. In fact, it has so well that one of the tests we had highlighted as a candidate for reuse was the one they reused, November 2020.
It's good to be right.
Yeah, it is. It feels rarer and rarer sometimes these days, but I'll take what I can get.
When you're engaging in speculation of the sort that we are, you want to be right more often than not. And we said this repeatedly. We make changes and predictions when we feel there's a reasonable degree of confidence in doing so, and that even if we were wrong, it would cause no harm. And we've been really, I think, wildly successful. I've often said to people that I work with, we have no right to get this correct the way we have been. But LSAC has backed themselves into a corner with the number of tests they have available, and they don't have that many tests available, and we have a ton of information on those tests. And for them, that's a really bad situation. For our students, it's a great situation. Sure. And the cool thing that you and I started to see after the tests on Friday and Saturday was we started getting messages about people who'd been at the Crystal Ball or in our LSAT courses who started to say, thank you.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things to have happen, because I'm like, no, thank you for being a student. I appreciate it. And I'm so glad we were able to help.
Yeah. But people ask, like, what's the point in predicting the reuse of a test that we don't have access to anyway? Because I don't have a copy of the November 2020 exam. I still don't have one, despite it just coming up again. And the reason that's so useful is because we can see the features, at least, that are emphasized in these tests. Points of, de-emphasis, points of high frequency, and tendencies within question types or game types or passages even, that we can then pick and choose, really cherry pick analogs for out of the stuff that is available. So for every one of these crystal balls, for those who attend, they'll know this, we compile a very, very detailed and customized problem set for each of the section types that we think is going to be the best possible match, preview really, of what we expect you to see on your upcoming tests. And we did that for March and April. And again, some of the things we emphasize, broad strength and a lot of principal types of strength. And those came up a ton here. A lot of pointed issue questions. I know on the international tests in particular, God, people were either greatly relieved to see a bunch of them or dismayed, depending on what they had prepped for.
They should be greatly relieved because there's a great technique to attack those that we developed that unlock those questions, I think, very effectively. Yeah. So they should be cheering.
I think the split point there was whether they were our students or not.
That's true.
For our students, yeah, it was time for celebration. So that's the reason that we do those crystal balls. It's not just so that we can speculate and kind of uselessly make predictions. Those predictions are tethered to things that are actionable. And that, to me, is really where the value of it comes in. And it certainly came in here. In fact, my favorite quote from a student, do you want to read it? You want me to?
Nah, you read it.
All right. This came in last night. I didn't see it until this morning, but it was a student who had taken the test yesterday as one of the makeups from Saturday. And this is really what caught my eye.
Yeah.
It's her first line. She says, Dave and Jon, y'all should know I spend more time with you both than I spend with my husband.
Nice.
Yeah. Trouble in paradise, I'm afraid.
I love that line, though.
It's kind of sweet, kind of frightening. But where it got relevant was the next line. She said, I'm writing to let you know the crystal ball prediction was, all caps, spot on for April, which I took today. Honestly, if I didn't have the crystal ball, I would have been screwed. So, thank you so much. And I just, first of all, I thought it was a very sweet note that she took the time to send us that.
Yeah, thank you.
Pity her husband. But the fact that she could actually tell the correlations were there and so meaningful, that's the reason we do those crystal balls and put so much effort into them.
That's exactly the reason why. And every single test, we get responses like that. And I had several that were like, one of the tests that you talked about, I went and kind of listened up on it. And when I started to see some of this, it rang some bells and I felt very calm. And that's the greatest thing that you can really give someone during the test is a sense of calmness and confidence. They don't need to know what the exact rule wording is to improve. It's sometimes that whole outlook. And that's the goal in the crystal ball, is to give you a roadmap to narrow what it is that you're studying and help highlight and focus your studying. And then sometimes to give you a sense of kind of difficulty of what we're seeing. And when we really get into the specifics of this is a test we think they're going to reuse, let's talk about the generalities of that test. Was it hard? Was it easy? Did it have weird stuff on it? That is a real sense of reassurance, and that's the whole goal with those. So obviously later on here in May, we're going to be doing another one. And if you're taking that June LSAT, we definitely encourage you to come hear what we have to say about it. And if you like it enough and you're not a student, take one of our courses where you'll get access to the Crystal Ball analytics and problem sets that we put together that are specifically tailored for preparation to each one of these tests. Nobody else is doing anything like this. I've said this repeatedly. No one else has the capacity to do anything like this and be as accurate as we have been. Jon, on that fabulous note,
yes,
let's continue to the final matrix of the day. 3 times I entered the matrix today.
That's right. Might be a new record.
Or maybe we just live in it constantly. I don't know. But this is the matrix for the main domestic test administration. Once again, starting at you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. And as Jon and I noted earlier, remember, we're always conservative in our estimations. That way, if we miss it, you get a more generous scale, not a less generous scale. Let's start off with those logic game sections. That first Friday logic game section about spices, film festival, music lessons, and the antique auction. This was basically a middle of the road type of section in difficulty. Still hard, but middle difficulty. That is not going to move the scale on the 23 questions there. And the same thing is going to be true on Saturday for that pet clinics, racehorses section. I know that those 2 games, especially that third one, were difficult, but the first 2 probably offset that because they were relatively straightforward. That is also no effect on your score. And so logic games is not going to move your scale for this test. You would stay at -7. Now we get to reading comprehension. And we've got 3 sections there that are floating around. The first one is that one about melodrama, and then the Cascadia earthquake, tsunami, the brainstorming, the award of damages. This is a hard section. This is going to loosen your scale by 1. So presuming you had that, and again, that was the scored section, that would take you from 7 to 8. The other section that a lot of people saw with that, let's just say for speculative purposes, if that was real, what would have happened? That was one about rock music, Beatles, artist royalties, medical ethics, depression, serotonin, and so forth. That would have no effect on the scale. So if that one was scored, your scaling would be -7 for a 170. But again, we don't think that was the case. We think that the earthquake one was the scored one, so -8. So I'm going to move forward as if we're really at -8 after that. Yeah. The other RC was also challenging. This was one about Harlem art, EU forest and fairy tales, acoustic law, the club cells in fish. That was tough. That would loosen it from 7 to 8. So again, neither logic game moves the scale, but both scored RC do in fact move the scale from 7 to 8. And all of those were 27 questions. And finally, that takes us down to LR. And again, we talk primarily about the section of traditional Japanese gardens, alcohol and exercise, the white tiger clubs, and the flood insurance as the main section that we know was real. That was not going to move the scale at all. For all other sections, as near as we can tell, they wouldn't move the scale as well. But again, our information there is a little bit less. And so the door is a bit more open. So no matter what happened here, logic games and logical reasoning don't move your scale from 7. Reading comprehension does, no matter which variation you have, which means that all scales for all test takers here would be -8. You could miss 8 questions to get a 170. Jon, you want to hit the downscale numbers?
Nicely done. I will, once I actually talk about that -8, because to me, of all the scaling we've done today, I think this is the one I feel the most confident about. I think that this was a -8 test, more or less no matter what, unless we're wrong about the reading comp and that rock music section was real, then it could go to a 7. But I felt very comfortable with -8 in this case, and I don't always. Sometimes I feel very kind of middled between 2 numbers.
Truly.
Yeah. Put it slightly differently, I don't think this test was as tough as January or February for most people, particularly most people where we're living now at the 170. But let's scale it down through the 160s to a 155. And talk about what happens there. These are going to be pretty similar to the scales that you heard me mention before. I think for 165 in this case, you could miss 13. I think for 160, you could miss 19. And for 155, I believe you could miss as many as 28.
And there you have it. The full matrix for that test. Obviously, feel free to send Jon or I a message or an email if needed. If you're like, hey, I had additional information, or I'm not sure about this, or I don't recall it. Obviously, all points of confirmation, all data points are incredibly useful to us. As we always tell people, thank you. We really appreciate it. We can't do this without your assistance, and you're helping future test takers as well. It's one of the most important things. The information that we get today could help a test taker next year or the year after. And so it slowly accumulates. And that's really the most important thing, is we want to help people, make them understand their test better and feel better about the experience. And the more information that we have, the better we can do that job.
Sure. That earthquake passage is a perfect example. If we hadn't heard from people with their experimental stuff on prior tests, we'd be entirely in the dark here.
All right. Well, scores will come out, as we said before, on Wednesday, May 18th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time or thereabouts. And once again, I would like to remind everybody, we're asking you not to summarize this online. If somebody wants to know, just tell them to come listen to the podcast, find their timestamp, and they can be off to the races. That way we know they'll get all the nuance of what we've talked about. Jon, any final words here?
My drink is empty.
So well, that means it's time to go.
I need to go find some more tequila.
All right. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And you can also leave us a comment or rating as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We often answer listener questions in episodes, and we certainly will be doing that in the near future. Hopefully you were able to get through your LSAT in the last couple of days. If not, we wish you the best of luck on Saturday and Tuesday of the upcoming week. Hopefully things go well for you. And if we get enough information, we'll go ahead and do a podcast recap of that as well. Otherwise, stay safe out there, and thanks very much for listening.